This podcast is made possible by the listener members of Nashville Public Radio.
This is a special edition of the NashVillager Podcast. I'm Tony Gonzalez, and we have a very special Saturday drop episode of our podcast today. Our team of reporters has been covering the run-up to the election for months now, and today's episode will catch you up on what you need to know as Election Day, which is November 5th, by the way, is approaching. First up, we have some crucial information for Tennesseans heading to the polls right now. Sometimes the name of the candidate selected by the voter on the screen isn't the one that's appearing on their ballot. WPLN's Power and Equity reporter, Marianna Bacallao, explains the voting machine isn't necessarily the problem.
Before you point the finger at voting machines, you might want to look at your own finger.
They are trying to punch that little box with their finger.
That's Jeff Roberts, the administrator of elections for Nashville. He says your finger is not as precise as the sticks that polling places have. Those sticks can zero in on the little box near the candidate's name. Roberts demonstrates on a sample voting machine that has canines instead of candidates. When he tries to vote for Beagle in the second row, it selects the Bulldog option above it. Since Republicans are listed first in races, when people run into this issue, it's usually because they wanted an option below the first. Roberts says it's easy to fix.
Once you're finished, it's going to allow you to review your selections. So that's your first check.
After that, you can print your ballot and double-check your choices. Let a poll worker know if you need to change it, and they can help you up until it's in the scanner.
Once it's in the scanner, we can't do anything with it. It's done. Your vote's completed at that point.
Roberts says the stick versus finger problem is a statewide issue. Marianna Bacallao, WPLN News.
Next up, we're taking things to the U.S. Senate. Democratic State Representative Gloria Johnson is challenging Republican U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn for one of Tennessee's 2 Senate seats. WPLN's Paige Pfleger reports the ads the candidates have released so far reflect their priorities, with Johnson making her case on Tennessee issues and Blackburn campaigning on her national record.
A lot of Johnson's ads start like this.
For 30 years, I was a teacher, not a politician.
She frames herself as a champion of the everyday Tennessean, talking about issues like healthcare costs, reproductive rights, and education.
What I do is fight for justice for real people, because that's what Tennessee deserves.
The spots feel local, with one tying back to the Covenant School shooting and her role as a member of the so-called Tennessee Three.
And when my friends and I believed mothers and fathers who'd lost children at Covenant deserved a voice, and we fought for it, they expelled them.
By contrast, Blackburn's ads mainly focus on issues with a national scope, touting her record since taking office in 2019 as the first woman to represent Tennessee in the U.S. Senate. One is about how tough she is on China.
Chinese communists are buying up land all over America.
Our farmland.
Land near military bases. It's happening right here in Tennessee.
And Marsha Blackburn won't stand for it.
It's worth noting Chinese-owned land is a tiny fraction of all foreign-owned land in the U.S., and an NPR investigation didn't find any in Tennessee. Another ad, narrated by a former pro wrestler, praises her stance on border security.
Marsha steps into the ring for Tennessee every day, blasting China, fighting inflation, and defending our border like a heavyweight champ.
Even though control of the U.S. Senate is up for grabs this November, this race probably won't decide that balance of power. No Democrat has won a statewide race in Tennessee since 2006.
I'm Gloria Johnson.
I'm Marsha Blackburn.
And I'm Paige Pfleger for WPLN News.
A couple congressional races are being closely watched as Election Day approaches. Nashville activist Miriam is running as a Democrat against incumbent Republican Andy Ogles for Tennessee's 5th Congressional District. Marianna sat down with to talk about the race.
If elected, what's the most important thing that you would want to accomplish?
Safety for our kids. There's nothing, I think, more profoundly impacting of me and my family, of all Tennessee families and certainly all District 5 families. I have worked with high school students that just look at me and say, just how come I went there every day? How come I talked to all those leaders? How come I've called all of them? How come, like, the amount that we have disillusioned them about our system and about our democracy is awful.
What would you see as paths to ensuring that safety?
Tennessee is known and made up of generations of responsible gun owners. Responsible gun ownership is something that a lot of people take a lot of pride in this state. That has nothing to do with the need and the changes that we have to make now. We actually just have to make sure that irresponsible gun owners do not get them. So I think background checks is a great start.
In this role, you wouldn't just be representing Davidson County. There's also, let me check my list here.
I can tell you, yeah.
Lewis, Murray, Marshall, Wilson, and Williamson counties.
Yes.
They're also a part of the 5th Congressional District. How do you plan on representing such a diverse group?
Getting to know people from all walks of life that aren't necessarily like me. It's just who I am. I'm predisposed for it. I was raised in Nashville in Tennessee. My parents come from Iran. I wasn't like everybody else necessarily, and I had to learn how to bridge those gaps and how to understand others and how to explain myself to others. I actually love that stuff. So how would I represent them? I would figure out what they're thinking. Right now, this week, I was talking to a few Republican voters, just trying to understand what are the issues that are most important to you. What makes you vote the way that you do? What makes you think the way that you do? And I enjoy those conversations. And sometimes they would say, well, I don't want you to think I'm voting for you, or I don't want you to think I'm donating to you. And I said, with all due respect, if I plan to represent this district, I want to know what you think regardless. And I'm sure there's a group of people that think like you or come from your walk of life. So, and I think that that's new for people. It's novel to have this concept of representation because we've had a supermajority for so long that just doesn't care. It almost doesn't even care about what its own constituents think. So how I would do it, I'd go down to Marshall County. I'd go down to Lewis County. I'd go to Hohenwald. I'd go to Columbia. I love this stuff. So that's what I'll do. And I will listen to anyone, even when it gets uncomfortable, even if we disagree.
How has your sort of outlook on this campaign changed since Ogles was officially made the Republican nominee?
Well, I think what was interesting is to look at what that primary showed. Courtney Johnson managed to bring in 24,000 votes, which is impressive. So what that left me with is if we unite, he will no longer bring this stain to our district. I think voters should know that they deserve someone who's qualified and they deserve someone who is curious about policy, someone who's committed to that. Right now in our current representative, we have someone that clearly has a disdain for the very job that he has. He's brought 100 bills, not one of which has seen the light of day. They have like these dramatic, kind of outlandish titles that are meant for the media. And then at the end of the day, he'll do a media spot. He'll sort of wash his hands and think he did the job of a congressperson. And then you look 2 years later and you wonder, well, where's the policy or the bill that was supposed to make District 5 better? And that there's nothing there. And then on top of that, there's federal money, our federal money, that no one's fighting to bring down here. That is one of the most immoral aspects of this. We need someone up there, not only in appropriations for the things that we need, but also the existing federal money for businesses, money for our environment, for our rivers, money for jobs, money for potholes, that no one's fighting for us. I don't think anyone's ever told him that the job he has is to go and get our problems solved.
That was Miriam Abel-Fossley, the Democratic candidate for Tennessee's 5th Congressional District. Miriam, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Marianna.
U.S. Congressman Mark Green is also on the ballot this November after initially announcing his retirement earlier this year. Green says he was encouraged by other Republicans not to hang up his hat just yet. For the wide swath of counties he represents, it's very likely Green will hold on to his seat, but But his Democratic opponent, Megan Barry, has one of the most well-funded campaigns of any member of her party in the state. Marianna has more.
One thing that's top of mind for both candidates this election:
fentanyl has flooded into the country. It's killed hundreds of thousands of people.
That's Mark Green in conversation with the editor-in-chief of Clarksville Now, his hometown newspaper. Green says immigration and the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border needs to change.
We need to do merit-based immigration. We do. It's best for our country.
But Green's opponent, former Nashville Mayor Megan Barry, wants to address the dangers of fentanyl from a public health perspective.
Things like the Modernizing Opioid Treatment Access Act, things like the Mental Health Justice Act, Saving America's Rural Hospitals, all of these things that could help constituents in Tennessee have a better life.
Barry says her approach to treatment is influenced by her own family tragedy.
We lost our only son, Max, to an overdose, a knock in the middle of the night that no parent wants to answer. Unfortunately, Max's story is not unique. The overdose crisis continues to ravage families in every community.
Barry's campaign also focuses on abortion access. Tennessee's abortion ban does not make exceptions for rape, incest, or the life of the mother.
If we leave it up to our state legislature and we don't have the ability to do a referendum like a lot of states do, so the only way Tennessee women are going to have the protection they deserve for their bodies is if we pass something at the national level.
The incumbent has a track record of opposing abortion, but did not respond to WPLN's request for an interview or for comment on the issue. The 7th District is expected to lean Republican, but the fundraising gap between the candidates is the smallest compared to the state's other contests. Marianna, Bacallao, WPLN News.
We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we'll have another story illuminating voting access issues in the state.
Are you a regular listener who has never given to WPLN before? I'm Catherine Ceces, a producer on This is Nashville, and I'm here to let you in on a secret. Giving to WPLN will change how you feel when you tune in to 90.3. You'll still hear all of the great local reporting that brightens your day, but you'll also feel more connected to the station, knowing that you are a part of the reason we are on the air. We are your station, so please be one of our contributors. Go to WPLN.org to donate now. Thank you.
We're back, and for our final story today, we're bringing you a conversation between LaTonya Turner and Char Daston that first aired back in July about how voting access in Tennessee has changed.
Hi, Char.
Hi, LaTonya. Good to talk to you.
I'm glad to hear from you about this. So, which groups are most affected by these changes to Tennessee's voting rules?
So, the people affected are mostly marginalized groups, people who have felony records, immigrants, and also political independents and people whose voting patterns are less predictable. The state legislature and the Secretary of State say that the new rules that they've put in place will make elections more secure and more trustworthy, but critics say that some of these rules could create unnecessary legal barriers for voters, and some other rules could intimidate people into not voting.
So when you say legal barriers to voting, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so some people who are maybe English language learners or seniors or new voters, sometimes they rely on these nonprofit voter registration organizations that help them through the voter registration process. There's a new law that enforces stricter regulations on these voter registration organizations. You get a $5,000 fine if people with certain felony convictions work for you. And speaking of felony records, Tennessee has one of the hardest processes for getting your voting rights restored if you have a felony on your record. So last year, the Elections Commission made that process discretionary. So they made you go before a judge who could deny you even after you've filled out all the proper paperwork. There was a lawsuit against that in federal court, and the judge ruled that the process can't be discretionary, but the process is still really time-consuming and confusing.
And it's clear that those legal barriers to voting lead to inequities from what you just described, but is there also a racial element to all of this?
Well, Tennessee has the second highest rate to Florida of people from all races who are disenfranchised. But Tennessee has the highest rate of any state of disenfranchisement for Black and Latinx voters, according to a nonprofit called the Sentencing Project. I talked with Mary Evans. She's a historian and the head of the American Democracy Project at MTSU. And she reminded me that people who are trying to restore their voting rights need to prove a lot of things, like have they paid their court debts? Have they paid child support?
I am loaded with little old white lady privilege. No one is asking me if I'm a good parent before I go in and cast my ballot. To me, it's irrelevant.
And she connects all of these rules with the post-Civil War era when Southern states passed laws criminalizing Black people to try to take some of their citizenship rights away.
So those things are quote unquote legal barriers. But what about intimidation, which can also create barriers for people to vote?
Tennessee has open primaries. You don't have to register as a Democrat or a Republican to vote in those parties' primaries. But there is a law on the books that says you have to be a, quote, bona fide party member to vote in primaries. And no one can tell you what that means. It's very confusing. There's a new law that passed this year that requires signage at polling places that tell voters that it's a crime to vote in a primary if you're not a bona fide member. Now, the League of Women Voters partnered with a group of voters who felt intimidated by that signage. They're suing the state. Also, there was a letter from the Secretary of State's office that was sent out to around 14,000 immigrants who became U.S. citizens. And the letter asked them to prove their citizenship by sending in documentation, like some form of an ID. There was also language in that letter about how it's a crime for non-citizens to vote. And here's what one recipient, Turgut Ovunk, told WPLN about his experience receiving the letter.
The intention of this letter is to clearly either intimidate immigrants or naturalized immigrants or to outright trick them in case they do not speak English that well.
The Secretary of State has since clarified you are not required to respond to this letter. But the AP reports that over 3,000 of the recipients did send in documentation, and another approximately 300 canceled their voter registration after receiving this letter.
Wow, it definitely created an impact based on what you just said. So what should we look for going forward with all this?
Well, I'm curious to see what the turnout will be in these next two elections among marginalized groups like immigrant voters who felt kind of targeted by these rules.
Well, that story aired back in July. Not much has changed since. The League of Women's Voters lawsuit was dismissed in August, meaning that those bona fide party signs will probably come around again during our next primary season. We hope you've enjoyed this special edition of the NashVillager Podcast. You can learn more about what's at stake this election by visiting WPLN.org/elections. While you're there, check out our coverage of the transit referendum, which is on the ballot as well in Nashville. And that's it for today. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with our regular roundup of Nashville news on Monday.